All right. Well, welcome everybody to our Ed webinar today, Improving K-3 Reading Achievement, How to Do This Right Now. I'm Jeanette Beninati, and I am joined by the dynamic duo of literacy, Stacy Hurst and Donell Pons. Reading Horizons would like to thank you again for coming to our session today. Reading Horizons is where reading momentum begins. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Donell and Stacy.
Well, thank you, Jeanette, for that great introduction. Hi, Donell, again.
Hi.
We're happy to be here with you. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with us by now. Donell, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah, just quickly. Stacy,
Yeah.
It feels like we've just done this, right? It feels like we've been here before.
It does.
So I am the mother of a few people who have dyslexia. So I have a few folks who have dyslexia in my household, as well as a husband who has dyslexia. So I came into the reading world by way of need. I had individuals who were struggling with reading, one who had struggled all the way into adulthood, attended college, tried to complete college and was unable to because of a reading deficit and difficulty, and then had children who had dyslexia and didn't have services provided that were going to help them become competent readers. And so that's how I kind of jumped into education and then really focused in on reading and doing a lot of training in reading. So that's my background.
Yeah, and I am a former first grade teacher and literacy coach, and now I teach at the university level. So Donell and I say all the time, I went upstream, she's downstream. She does tutoring now for struggling readers, and yeah, we cover the gamut. We're so glad you're here to join us. So today we have a topic that's pretty broad. We're gonna yeah, we're going to keep it at a fairly general level, but we really hope that you can take something away that you can apply tomorrow, even if it is a new way of thinking about something. So we are really glad that you're here. So I'm going to start with a little story, and this is a personal narrative. I didn't actually write it down. I'm just going to tell you. But when I was in college, and I went to college at Southern Utah University, the same place I teach right now. It's beautiful down here, so everybody's welcome to come visit. But there's so many. We're within like an hour and a half of 3 national parks. Anyway, my friends and I, every Thursday morning, we actually called it Adventure Thursdays. We would go cross-country skiing, or we'd go on some kind of adventure. We made sure we didn't have classes Thursday morning, but we all had them Thursday afternoon. And one day we decided to go cross-country skiing. It's in the winter, and we went up the mountain at our usual place. And I remember this because I had a very important test that afternoon in class. We thought, no problem, we'll have plenty of time. It was sunny. We get our skis on, we start skiing, and then fog sets in as we're heading back to the car. And we were like, wow, this fog is really dense. It makes it hard for us to see, but we know we're going the right way, right? We're just trekking along, and Donell, you ski, you get this, like, oh yeah, we're not on a trail, we're not on a path. We're like, yeah, I'm pretty sure we're going in the right direction. We're going to the car. We get to the road that our car was parked on, but the car is nowhere near. The fog lifts a little bit, and we're probably about a mile away from our car. But we were so certain. We were so sure that we were so close. And I tell you this story because I think when we're talking about reading instruction, we sort of start out the same way, really excited, happy for that adventure. And then some unexpected things happen. Those things that may not make our trek as easy as we want it to. And in this particular story, I had a lot of misguided confidence. I was certain we were heading in the right direction. Turns out we weren't. But what would have helped is if I had been prepared, thought ahead, that we would have had a GPS or a compass or anything that would keep us oriented to the place we needed to go, which was the car. And just a side note, I did not make it in time to take that test. So I still remember that. It's probably why this whole thing is memorable to me. But today, so we'll anchor that with this story, anchor our conversation today. But we're really going to talk just about where we are in the world of reading right now. A lot has happened in the last few years, and I tell my students it's an exciting time. Some of us may not feel like that, but I think in the history of it all, it could be. So we'll talk about a brief history of reading instruction, where we're going, how we get there, including those roadblocks and resources. And then because technology is new to all of this, we'll talk about that for a minute as well as how will we know when we get there, right? When the fog lifts, or even if it doesn't, we know if we've gotten there. So I want you to think for a minute about our goals of reading instruction. And I know that seems like a really simple question, but when we think maybe bigger picture, when I was teaching first grade, I wanted my students to have that solid foundation so they literally could follow their curiosities and learn anything they wanted to learn, that they would have access to that information. And of course, we want that foundation to be solid so that they build a lifelong habit of reading. Donell, what would be some of your goals for reading instruction?
Yeah, absolutely. Stacy, since I spend most of my time now working with adults and older learners, college students as well. And so I'm really in the space of what happened to individuals, what happens to individuals when they don't get what they need when they're younger, right? And how much that impacts their lives. So all of the time I'm going back and doing sort of recovery, really is what it is. It's recovering what was lost, what wasn't learned. And so as I'm instructing and providing that foundation and providing the instruction in a way that many of my students have never had it given to them before, I never stop to marvel at how amazing it feels to someone who never got it. You make it into your adulthood and suddenly you get it. And that the marvel of it
Wow.
never changes for me in seeing that in an adult person's life.
I love that. And, I bet it's very similar to when I would see younger students start reading everything. It's like it unlocks a whole new world to them.
Yep.
So, okay, I hope the rest of you are thinking about those reading goals. Feel free to put some in the chat. Um, and just keep that in mind as we talk about where we are as a country. I'm going to let Donell is going to address this when we're talking about our NAEP scores, among other
Yeah, boy,
indicators.
we've had many a conversation about the NAEP scores, but we many have, and always it's in a conference. Whenever we're talking about reading, we can go to the NAEP and discuss the reading scores. It drives a lot of legislation in different states, right? It's a talking point for a lot of what we do in terms of trying to legislate to help improve our reading scores. And so the NAEP scores are important. One of the things, and obviously, we're going to say the same things about the NAEP scores. They're stagnant. Rather than seeing growth, we either stagnate, sometimes we backslide. But we don't see the growth we want to see. And what it indicates to us, a big takeaway is that the majority of students who are exiting our school system do not have the skills in reading that they need to be successful at a job that requires reading or literacy skills, or at college, further education. And of course, that's where I am. I see that every day. But the other thing that I think is interesting in reading over the NAEP, and I just did it again this morning, it talks about the fact that the level at which we consider a student proficient when they take the NAEP score really isn't terribly rigorous. And in fact, that level, even though we consider it not terribly rigorous, is sometimes even more rigorous than some of the state levels. So again, I mean, the NAEP and looking at these test scores, what I want the takeaway and what a lot of researchers, the takeaway is the overall thought that we could be doing so much better. And we know that. We know that there are a lot of students that we're not helping, that we're missing, that we're losing, and we can do better because we know better.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, I mean, the NAEP scores, we can start as early as fourth grade and see where we are. And so it's
Yeah.
been consistent. It really has not a lot of change over the past. I know that one thing that surprised me when I became a literacy coach at my school, and for the first time I was looking at data that was school-wide, not, hyper focused on my class or grade level. And I was surprised because I felt like we were doing better than the NAEP at my school. But honestly, when we first started down the path we were on to improve literacy, our scores were very similar to the NAEP scores. Our fourth graders were scoring in a similar way. So how did we get here? And I am going to briefly address this, and I am going to reference Steve Dykstra as we talk about this. He put this in such great perspective for me. And it really not only helped me to learn how we got to where we are, but it informs what I do going forward. And so he talks about 3 studies that were published in 1967, so a really long time ago. And he compares, I know it's a while back, he compares the influence that these studies had on what ended up happening in the classroom. So he talks about learning to read, The Great Debate by Jean Chall. Lots of us have heard of this study. As it was published, it was 372 pages long. And she followed a group of students over the years, and she gathered a lot of information about what we should be doing to teach reading proficiently. There were a lot of things in that report, but one thing that stood out was that they need to be taught explicitly to connect those sounds to spellings. And then at the same time, there was also another longitudinal study that involved, again, hundreds of students. And these were the first grade studies by Guy Bond and Robert Dykstra. That entire study was over 1,000 pages. So it was really a lot of information. And so much of what they found corroborated with Jean Chall's findings. There was a lot of consensus, especially around the need to teach what we refer to now as phonics, right? And then at the same time, Ken Goodman, many of you have heard his name. If you read Emily Hanford's articles, she mentions him by name, but he published a 9-page research study that was titled Reading, a Psycholinguistic Guessing Game. And his subject size was 1 student. And he observed him as he read, and he noticed he was doing things like looking at the picture to figure out the word, or going to the end of the sentence to see what would make sense. So the really big difference, besides the length of the studies and the sample size that they were analyzing, was the philosophy behind it. So Jean Chall and the first grade studies came away with, we need to be explicitly teaching phonics. And that was their takeaway, one of the takeaways. So many things. I recommend that you look into those, because a lot of what they found, we see again in the National Reading Panel, and just some really high quality stuff. Anyway, the difference with Ken Goodman's paper was that he felt that reading developed naturally like speech. And it was very clear in the other studies that speech and reading and print were different from each other in the way that we acquire ability to manage either one. And so that philosophy of Ken Goodman's, that speech happens naturally, and that paper was the one that ended up influencing the way that we teach reading. Because essentially he was saying, if you just surround them in text, they'll pick it up. There are a lot of things we can do to help them with the print, like having them look at the picture or think about what would make sense there, and just really focusing on getting meaning out of print, which is everybody's focus. But the difference was the route, I would guess. So Steve Dykstra says we all have a direct line to at least one of these 3 studies. And as I mentioned before, I taught first grade, and I did read not the full 1,000-page report. They have a synopsis that's a lot more palatable. I did read the first grade studies before I started teaching first grade. I was also lucky enough to start teaching in 2001, so right after the National Reading Panel had published their report. But another result of those studies was the whole language movement. So a lot of what happened, as I mentioned, was based on Ken Goodman's research and the fact that the idea that reading develops naturally like speech. So that went on for a long time. I was taught whole language practices when I was in college. And then at the same time, though, Marilyn Yeager Adams, who was doing research of her own, a lot of which focused on what Jean Chall had started, and the phonics and the connection between speech and print, was kind of saying, wait a minute, this isn't making sense based on what I'm learning in research and what those other studies said. And in part, because of Marilyn Yeager Adams' research, the National Reading Panel was convened and they did a meta-analysis. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir. You guys are very familiar with this. And as a result, they highlighted 5 things that we need to be paying attention to in our reading instruction, one of which was, no surprise, phonics. And again, that was kind of at the center of the debate. There's a lot of other things that go into reading. But as a result of that, the whole language application of the science turned to balanced literacy. Now we're applying new science, which is what we should do as a teaching profession. We should respond to that science. So we march happily along for a long time with balanced literacy approaches. Again, I was taught some of those as well. And then we have decoding dyslexia happening at the same time. And when Donell was introducing herself, a lot of that was reminiscent of why decoding dyslexia even got started, because there were a lot of students who were struggling that were not catching up. And then we owe a lot, I feel like, as a profession, to Emily Hanford and her great research and reporting of what she learned, bringing a new focus and attention back onto what we now refer to as the science of reading. And in application, we call that structured literacy. And that's where we are today. That's why I say it's really exciting that we are here and we know where we are. So there are a lot of us who are making a lot of changes based on the science that we're now becoming more aware of. And we're in hopes that today we will be able to give you a little direction, help the fog lift a little bit, and to help us head towards those goals that we have for reading. Donell, what do you have to say about any of that?
Yeah, I was just thinking, Stacy, when you were talking about this and going over the timeline, my mother was an educator, and my mom's has passed away and has been gone quite a while. But I remember that when we were cleaning out the house, I stumbled across a box of her education master's program that she had started and not finished. So this would have been the 50s when she was in that program. And phonics was all over in her paperwork, which was very interesting. And then I also remember, as a young person starting elementary school, the conversation, I remember distinctly listening to my mom in the school office at the elementary school, talking to the secretary, a person that she knew very well. And she said, I would love for my daughter to be in her class. She knows phonics. And I remember hearing the term when I was little. And then as I got older, struggling with my own children, revisiting a lot of that. Oh, that's what my mother. So as an educator, she would have known. She watched and she knew. So it's interesting to see through time a lot of the terminology and the learning and that history, as you say, with the research.
Yeah, I love that. One thing I really appreciate from all the research is that even though sometimes we look at English and think it's really hard to teach reading in English, it's a system, it's a language based on individual phonemes. And we have 44 and we have just over 250 spellings for those phonemes. But it's going to be really useful for our teaching because that's what we teach. That's our syllabus, so to speak. So if you have students and you're focusing on the sounds in our language, connecting them with the spellings for those sounds, and then giving them lots of practice to read text that is manageable for them at first, we call it decodable, and then continue to build that ability to read proficiently so your brain can be freed up to focus on comprehension and all the rich things that reading has to offer. One thing that I found really comforting as a first grade teacher in an odd way was the research that told us that most students can learn to read proficiently. And the numbers are right around 95%. 95% of our students have all the capabilities to be able to learn to read proficiently. Why did that give me hope? Because even though as a brand new teacher, I did not know everything about what I was doing, I knew there was a way. I had a lot of confidence in that. So it kept me working and figuring it out. And that's when I read the National Reading Panel report and learned what I should be doing in my classroom. So that's where we're heading. 95% of our students, you remember the NAEP percentages that Donell just shared with us, and we're not there yet. So we've got some places to go. So how do we get there? And yeah, I'm hoping you're making the connection between Interstate 95 and 95%. I thought it was pretty clever, but maybe I'm overstating
It is clever.
Thank you, Donell. I can always count on you to help to reinforce my thinking. So how do we get there? First and foremost, we're not getting anywhere near that without you guys, without the knowledgeable teachers who know what they are doing and have a love and desire to make a difference in the lives of their students. And then
Stacy,
that
make no
involves those.
mistake.
Yeah,
Make no
please.
mistake,
Yeah.
when we say that 95%, we're talking about a lot of different learners in that 95%. Okay, so let's be totally honest and frank here, right?
Yeah.
So I think when we say that, even when you look at the statistic, I've seen the report that says, 95%. I totally understand that, and they're absolutely right. But at the same time, remember represents a lot of different needs, right, within that
Yes.
learning. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where knowledgeable teachers come in too. I mean, we don't teach the same kids. Every year, our class and the individuals in our classes are different, no matter the setting we're working in, right? And we need to
Yeah.
know the reading profiles of each of our students. But that also gives me encouragement that even those who don't pick up to reading readily, right? We now know what to do. And yes, we need practice. I still am practicing to get better at that, but we do need knowledgeable teachers. And then those, obviously, that leads to good and best practices, how we implement that in the classroom. And a lot of that has to do with resources, right? Like having that high quality curriculum that we need and the resources we need to differentiate that instruction. Donell, like you were talking about, the 95% represents so many different kinds of readers. And as teachers, there are speed bumps. There are a lot of speed bumps on the way, and a lot of them have to do with time to differentiate instruction for all students. So we do have roadblocks. And I want to recognize right now that I've just listed 4. We haven't even brought up COVID. We haven't even brought up some other things we deal with as educators daily. So I do understand and recognize there are more than these 4 roadblocks. But I think if we can address these, then that will help mitigate some of the other factors as well. Professional development. We need our teachers to have access ongoing, right? How many of us are ever done learning? I don't know. I'm certainly not. And then implementation resources and support. And that does include curriculum that is aligned with what we know, with what we've learned, the settled science, so to speak. And then making sure that we have the resources to differentiate instruction for all students. Those are all things that we need to address, those roadblocks on our way to making sure most students learn how to read proficiently. Donell, what are you thinking as you see those roadblocks?
Yeah, no, I'm just looking at the same list and thinking you're right. There are many, many more than this that we have listed. However, just looking at this, I'm thinking of my first teaching assignment where I walk into my classroom, fresh teacher out of a teaching program, had excellent instruction, but walk into a classroom and I'm told that I am in a general English class. And yet I have just maybe 3 students that are reading at grade level, and all the rest are anywhere from 3 grade levels below to kindergarten. And this is all in a 7th grade class, right? So those experiences happen. And what we have to do is recognize that what that teacher needs, that would have been me at that moment. What I needed was somebody who said, okay, we're committed to the professional development that you're going to need ongoing, right? Just because you arrive fresh from a teaching program doesn't mean you know everything. And now you have this classroom of very diverse learners with very different skills, but we're going to give you the background and training that you need and the materials that you need to be able to do it that will match what you're learning, right? So I have what I need in my classroom when I arrive as well. And that didn't happen for me. So what did I do? That first summer, I rent a car and drive myself to a training. So these are, as we list them here, we need help with this, right? So we need to recognize that when a teacher enters a classroom, that teacher needs to be given the supports and able to reach those students, right?
Absolutely. And we know what happens when that is consistently not the case. We have people leaving the profession because we're burnt
Yeah.
out. And then somebody mentioned in the chat, um, compassion fatigue. When you
Yeah.
don't have resources, even to teach, what you were hired to teach, and you see everything in the lives of our students that we know will help improve that. I totally understand that. And as we talk about resources for teacher training, we're focusing on reading instruction right now, but there are other resources outside of that. In the chat, we have somebody mention compassion fatigue training. There is a PD for that. And so again, we're going to focus on reading in this particular ed webinar, but there will be others, I'm sure, that can address that as well. So here are some teacher training resources specific to that implementation piece. How will we know what good curriculum is if we don't have the training to understand what we're looking for? Most of us who are reading teachers have heard one way or the other about letters training. Donell mentioned that the NAEP scores are driving a lot of legislation in many states. That kind of letters training is being funded. It's expensive to pay for, in my opinion, as a personal educator on your own. So there are other resources that are cheaper and even free that are still based on science and have a great focus on implementation. I did personally, as well as letters, completed the Reading Teacher's Top 10 Tools. That's by Deborah Glazer. And I loved those because they were so practical. Letters is literally what we should have learned in college. And then the top 10 tools has more of a practical application. What I took away a lot from that I was saying, oh, I'm doing that in my classroom. I need to make sure I'm doing that. So that's another resource. And then Reading Rockets is somewhere that I send my students to frequently. They have a lot of great information on that website. And they do have a course that you complete, especially if you're at the beginning of your science of reading journey, called Reading 101, A Guide to Teaching Reading and Writing. So those are some resources for teacher training. And then, I was thinking about this the other day too. I'm a reading teacher. I don't know why I feel like I'm going to be stating the obvious, but I had a really reflective moment where I felt really grateful that I can read and comprehend, because I think the books that I read about teaching reading and about meeting students where they are have made such an impact on my career. Here are some that we would refer to as seminal at this point. So we have Speech to Print by Louisa Moats, Language at the Speed of Sight by Mark Seidenberg, Proust and the Squid, Proust, I say it differently every time, Unlocking Literacy, Reading in the Brain. There's a lot of really great information here. It is a lot. I remember the first time reading Overcoming Dyslexia and learning so much. But I was implementing reading strategies to make sure I was comprehending. Donell, you've read all these books, I'm sure. Anything you would say
Yes.
about these?
So the Overcoming Dyslexia. So I've got that one right here. It's always sitting close by. Stacy knows this. I love to have them
Yes,
stacked around me.
sure.
This is a fantastic book. It's just had a reissue or reedition. It's new. It just came out in 2020 again. What was fantastic, Stacy, is as a mother of two children who had dyslexia and a husband with dyslexia, this is one of the first times that I had the really good information all in one place. Now the internet is rife with help, right? That tells you how old I am. But at the time, really, it was this book and how dense it was with information, yet also very approachable too. And it started me
Yeah.
on my journey, right, for the rest. And then David Kilpatrick, Can't Say Enough About Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties, a fantastic book. Again, sits right here all the time. I have it right on my lap all the time, it seems like. And I mark it up, like you were saying. There's a lot of information here. I do a reread every year just because I
Yeah.
try to keep things fresh, right? So again, as
Yeah.
Stacy said, this is a lot of information, but you'll find things that really speak to you. These are all within the same wheelhouse. And then you just dog ear and mark the things that are most helpful and go back. You also share them with others within your school, other teachers, so that you can talk about it, retain it, kind of work with the information. That's the best way to do it, right?
I love that. And so many people in the chat are mentioning that they either love these books or they're taking letters training. And we know learning is social, but the more that we talk about it, the more knowledge is going to grow. And then, like Donell said, I loved Proust and the Squid. And I read it about the same time I read Overcoming Dyslexia. It helped me so much to know what is happening in the brain of my students when I'm teaching reading. And that has made a big difference for a lot of the decisions I had to make in the moment when I was seeing a kid struggle with a word. Anyway, there's a lot there. All that information starts to converge to a point that you, as an educator, have a really solid foundation. Here are some that are a little more practical in their application of that science. The first one on this is one I just actually require for a class that I'm teaching for my pre-service teachers because it is so practical. It's The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading by Christopher Such. And I recommend it, of course, but it is also brief and to the point. One thing to mention is that Christopher Such is very knowledgeable. He's British, and so that will help explain some of the spelling of the words and some of the terminology. But I've found it so far very useful. And then Teaching Reading Source Book, and that's that big fat core book that some of you have seen. There really are a lot of practical activities, and it does also do a good job of explaining the science and rationale for each of those. And then Equipped for Reading Success is the application of David Kilpatrick's work. And it really is a curriculum, so to speak, for phonemic proficiency. And then How We Learn by, oh, sorry, go ahead, Donell.
Yeah, and more. I mean, there's more than just that within Equipped for Reading Success. So he just really lays out also lesson plans.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
There's more there. Yeah.
Scaffolding, a lot of really great questions answered there. And he has some of the most robust answers to questions. I love it.
Yeah.
Robust and practical. And then How We Learn was, I continue to refer to that. Donell talks about that. I have 2 copies, one in my office on campus, one here. They're marked up, they're tabbed. And can I just put a plug in for naps? We need sleep. That's how all this information congeals. So we'll tell everybody listening today, after this, go take a nap and everything will just sink in. But it is a really good book. He is an expert on what is happening in our brains as we read, but also what we need to do in our teaching. He talks about the importance of engagement and so many things. Anyway, I can't say enough about it. And then also a brand new book. In fact, I think I have this one nearby. Yes. Structured Literacy Interventions, Teaching Students with Reading Difficulties. And actually a friend of mine tried to order it the other day. It was on back order. I'm not sure where she was ordering it from. But it is a really great book. In the same way, has a lot of really practical applications. And then a lot of people have heard about A Fresh Look at Phonics from Wiley Blevins. And that's also highly recommended from my friends who have read that. So those are just some suggestions, a lot cheaper than taking a full-blown professional development course, but I recommend both, right? Do all the things if you have the time. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, again, remember how research has informed practice. And now that we know about the science of reading, which is literally a lot of research studies, a body of research informing how we teach, the application of that, the implementation is called structured literacy. And I think this infographic does a really good job of displaying that. And Donell does an even better job at explaining it. So I'm going to let you do that, Donell.
I do like the graphic. And, it's interesting, Stacy, because now a lot of us are so familiar with the term structured literacy, but to remember that it was a trademark term with IDA, the International Dyslexia Association. Right. Dr. Louisa Moats and others had sat down and hashed out how to say this. So it's had a lot of thought and process in it. you can download a lot of this information and look at the graphic at the IDA website, the International Dyslexia Association website. But it is really good, Stacy, because it reminds us, look at the inside of the circle. As you look at the circle on the inside, what we're looking at there are the structured literacies elements, right? So there we have the phonology. That's the study of sound structure of spoken words. It's a key element of structured literacy instruction. Remember too that as they talk about phonemic awareness, it's the ability to distinguish, segment, blend, manipulate sounds relevant. That's the key word, relevant to reading and spelling. So that's interesting. We always have to make sure these things come back around and help each other, right? Then there's the sound symbol association that's also on the inside of the circle there. Once students develop phonemic awareness, they must learn the alphabetic principle, how to map phonemes to letters or those graphemes and vice versa. Then you have syllables. So knowing the 6 syllable vowel grapheme types, they refer to as the 6 there. Some have different numbers for them, but there's some basic ones there. That helps readers associate the vowel spellings with vowel sounds. Syllable division rules help readers divide and decode unfamiliar words, multisyllabic unfamiliar words. So again, if you're thinking about how you're teaching or a program or how to look at a curriculum, these are the things that you can be walking through and looking at to say, does my curriculum really meet the needs here? Morphology. So a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning in language. Studying base elements and affixes helps readers decode and unlock the meanings of complex words. So that's where morphology can come into play. And see how this can all just intertwine within a lesson, within study, right? We don't have to do this separately or outline, and you may be doing a lot of this in your practice. So tick those boxes as you're doing it in your practice. There's syntax. It's the set of principles that dictate the sequence and function of words in a sentence. It includes grammar, sentence structure, and the mechanics of language. And remember, we can teach this while we're doing dictation. In moments of dictation, we can also pull it out when we've done a read. So there are lots of ways in which we can weave this together. Semantics is concerned with meaning. So that's the structured literacy curriculum from the start, includes instruction in the comprehension and appreciation of written language. So there again, this is interwoven throughout. That's the inside of the circle. And then on the outside of the circle there that Stacy has, you can see outlined on the outside, is that's how you teach this, right? So how do I put all these pieces together? So it's the systematic and the cumulative way in which we teach, right? So there's a systematic, which means that it's organized in a way that's logical. It follows an order of language. The sequence begins with the easiest and most basic concepts and elements, and it moves and progresses methodically to the most difficult. It's cumulative because it means each step is based on concepts previously learned. So really think about how that happens in your instruction. It's explicit because structured literacy instruction is direct teaching of concepts with continuous student-teacher interaction. In that book, How We Learn by Stanislas Dehaene, he talks about many of the concepts that we've learned, and one is immediate direct feedback for certain things that we're learning, right? And so not allowing someone to just sit and kind of struggle with something that needs to be explicit and direct, like many of these concepts, basic concepts in reading do. So that's interesting. As I was going through this and seeing Stanislas making reference to that, it was very interesting to make those connections. And the diagnostic, teachers must be adept at individualized instruction. So that means is really knowing where your students are. And a lot of that not only is assessment, but it's also in the day-to-day interactions that you have in watching how students approach language tasks, spelling, and the reading. What is the spelling and the spelling errors? What are they telling you? What are some of those language and spoken word errors telling you as well about what the perception is from the student of spoken language, which informs their reading too. So all of that comes together. See, outside of the wheel there is how we're going to teach all of those elements with inside the wheel. So I just love this graphic because it is very thorough, isn't it, Stacy, from structured literacy?
Yeah, it really does cover so much. I love the outside of the wheel also because it takes the components of the inside of the wheel and makes sure that we're doing them in a developmentally appropriate way. We are not going to do anything without making sure it is where the student needs to go next. We know what happens when we try to do that, right? So I also love that it gives us opportunities to integrate. When you were talking about morphology and meaning, we teach other subjects in the day as teachers. We teach science. That's a great place to emphasize morphology. And math even. I was in a kindergarten classroom just this morning, and they were talking about semantics of a simple equation, 2 plus 7 equals 9. And they were talking about the plus sign also means and or add. And then the equals means the same as or is. And so they were building those meaningful connections between words and what we're saying, no matter the content area. So I love that this addresses that. And for English language learners, I think it is really helpful for those of us working with students who are learning English as a second or third or fourth language, because we know what to address, right? We start with the phonemic element, the sounds in English.
The sounds.
And if we know enough to compare them to the sounds in their native language, and then that really helps from there, you can build to the symbol part, which is in English letters, right? To symbolize the sounds. And then just how those work together is semantics and syntax too, in English compared to maybe their native language. So this really does it's the structure of English that we're talking about here. English is not crazy. There is a structure to it. And I love that we can explicitly teach that. So thank you for going over that with us, Donell. It's a great resource. Now, I remember learning about a lot of things and feeling like, okay, I'm applying this in my classroom, but I'm still not seeing the progress I want to. And in truth, what needed to happen was that I needed to stop doing some things because it was interfering, competing philosophies, I guess, in practice. So this infographic does a really good job of comparing typical literacy that is typically referred to as balanced literacy, and then structured literacy that's based on the science of reading. And I don't want to get those two terms confused. Not to oversimplify it, the science is massive and we learn a lot from it. The term structured literacy is what we need to think of, or will be a help to us as we think about implementing that science. And so it is very helpful to keep the two terms separate but related as well, as to know how they're related. So in those typical literacy practices that you see on the left side of the screen, there were some things that I have shored up in my instruction. Some of them I've stopped doing based on that, and these are just some of them, but phonemic awareness is evident in a balanced literacy classroom. Thank you to the National Reading Panel. But phonemic awareness is covered either haphazardly or not at all, meaning there's no connection to print. We're spending our 10 minutes a day on phonemic awareness and then moving on, but not really connecting it in the way that we need to. And then another thing that really spoke to me, and I realized as soon as I stopped focusing on this in my first grade class like I had been, is memorizing words. And I know we have a lot of irregular words in our language, not as many as we think, but we do have some very common ones that I was initially just teaching my students to memorize, but we know better now. We need to teach them phoneme by phoneme, grapheme by grapheme. So as you look at this list, just think about your practice and maybe think about some things that would be beneficial for you to stop doing, in addition to adding in what all the things you're learning about doing, right? Donell, anything to add to this?
Yeah, I just keep thinking, Stacy, about older students. So many times people will say, so what do I do with the older student? Well, what the younger student needs, the older student needs. It's not a whole different way of learning how to read. They need the same skills. We approach it in the same way. So just how you can accelerate it, but you still need to fill in all those blanks if they're missing. So to the point, I even had a read just this week with one of my adult students who's in his 50s. And we've made such great progress in 2 years. He has dyslexia. He's struggled for his entire life and never called himself a reader. Reading's always been difficult. But a lot of the things that you and I have just covered that you do with young students, we do all the time together. And that's where he's seeing progress. So just to keep that in mind as you go.
I believe that so much. And, even my college students, as soon as I say, that print is speech in a visual form, it is like, whoa, nobody ever told me that before. And just knowing that those letters spell the sounds in English is a big step with those pre-service teachers. It kind of reframes the way that they view what our instruction as well. So I can only imagine and have seen, Donell, the impact that you're talking about with older learners when that code is literally unlocked for them. And then the last bullet point on this, I think is important. Lots of class time devoted to independent reading. And as you were talking about older readers, Donell, I've been in a lot of classrooms where it's usually silent reading.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that there are a lot of kids who really aren't reading.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretending to read, and they have really big books. And so in some classrooms, that can be up to a half an hour that they're just sitting there looking like they're reading.
Killing time.
Yeah, I tutored a sixth grader who told me that his strategy during that time was to watch the kid sitting next to him. And every time he turned his page, the kid next to him would turn the page. He'd count to 3, then turn the page. So he wasn't even engaging with that text. In a structured literacy classroom, there's very little time devoted to independent reading. In the earlier grades especially, there's still a lot of reading time. That's what we need to happen. But there's a lot of feedback in that time so that students aren't developing those habits that will not serve them well in the future, and that teachers can help ensure and diagnose that they're getting the information they need. Okay.
And Stacy, students or
Yeah.
older students, because I was going to say on the independent reading for older students, the critical piece there, if you have a classroom of older students you're intervening on reading, was to always make sure that each had something at their level. So that took a little bit of time in the beginning. It's part of your diagnostic, right? But then making sure that you had that correct. And then it's checking in with the readers during the independent reading time. You're checking in with the readers, and maybe you're doing a paragraph share. They do one, you do one, and you're just always inserting yourself into the independent reading to make sure that it truly is moving along and there's momentum to it with those older students, as I said.
Yeah, and I read a lot in my first grade teaching time of on fluency. Dibbles was just starting to get a lot of traction. Timothy Rosinski and others. Joe Torgeson really helped inform this practice in my classroom too. But I had an independent reading time of day. In first grade, we had to build up to 20 minutes, but it wasn't silent. And if you can imagine how that would sound in my classroom, I wouldn't say cacophony because students were engaged in their text, but they were reading out loud. So there was always at least a low hum. We used the phonics phones so that kids didn't get too loud. But it gave me the opportunity to do just what you were saying, Donell. I would walk around. I would listen to most every student during that time frame, or I'd pull some students back to my table and we'd read. I'd give them immediate feedback as well. So there really are a lot of things we can do in practice that will help develop the things that we're talking about here. And I always compare that reading time that we need to learning to drive a stick shift. I could learn independently how to work the gear shift. I could learn independently how to work the clutch. I called it a clutch. But unless I have the actual practice in using them together, I'm not going to be proficient at driving a stick shift. It's the same with reading. We can have our phonics time. We can have our phonemic awareness time. But if we're not connecting all of that to text, then we need to make sure that we're doing that. So as far as curriculum, what do we need to look for? Scarborough's Reading Rope is a great resource. Many of us have heard of this. If you haven't, I recommend spending some time with it. The components are all listed there that we need to be making sure that we're addressing in our instruction. There's a different emphasis depending on where your students are developmentally, but it's all leading to skilled reading. And it's another place where we learn that we need the time to actually apply those skills as well as students become increasingly automatic and strategic in their reading. And then we talked about differentiation, and this can be an entire webinar on its own. There's really a lot involved here. And Donell, if you'll just synthesize this for us, give us a resource.
Right. Yeah. And particularly when you're teaching reading, that's all you're doing, right? Because as we said, that 95% of students that we know can become good readers. That's a really diverse group, a really diverse group. And particularly in reading, you are differentiating all of the time. I mean, there isn't a time when you're not. But just the things to think about in a differentiated classroom, this is where teachers provide specific ways for each individual to learn as deeply as possible and as quickly as possible. That can only happen by differentiation. But remember, we have some key pieces in that structured literacy as we were looking at it, how you teach, that we're being direct and explicit, right? And those are some key features so that we can really make sure that we've given the information directly and explicitly, and the students have an opportunity to practice with it right away, right? So in that way, that is nice in a differentiated classroom because you can see it right away. And then we also work diligently to ensure that struggling, advanced, and in between students think and work harder than they're meant to. So we have these different levels that we're working with, and that can be in transfer, right? We talked about that within transfer. We talked about that within reading, actually taking now what I've taught you and practicing as we move this into writing and reading, and then taking it into the practice, and we can level that as we do it. I saw somebody in the chat who was talking, Stacy, about younger readers sometimes don't have the same interest perhaps in learning to read like an
Mhm.
older adult learner does. But
Yes.
I say there are challenges across the board with reading, challenges across the board, because with those older learners, as I've mentioned before, there's a lot of really bad habits that they picked up because they just didn't have any help, didn't know what to do. So they just struggled. And there's a lot of habits that are in place that are very difficult to break. The other thing is there's embarrassment and all kinds of things. So there are difficulties on that end. And then likewise, when you're talking about younger ones, when you say, well, they don't see how important this is, the adults do, but the younger ones don't. But what was interesting with my learners too, and my young ones, is that for those that were struggling, there were always options. So we always had options to be able to listen to or ear read what was at grade level and their peers were doing, and then also the option to be able to practice with what was where they were at then, right? So that's the thing about having lots of levels in order for a student to participate with the reading, right? So that's
Yeah, and young students are so influenceable. Influenceable. I just about turned it into a disease. Influenceable. We can influence them greatly. It's important that we're modeling that excitement for reading and bringing it to life. I remember I had a student just like that, not necessarily really interested in reading, although I spent all day in my classroom saying, reading is awesome. We love reading. But we had a group lesson and we were reading a nonfiction book about peanut butter, and we actually made peanut butter. And I saw that click in the student's brain of, I can get really cool information out of books and turn it into something that is really interesting to me. And that student changed from then on. So we do have to attend to so many things as teachers. That on
yeah,
this slide where you've listed here readiness, interest, and learning profile, that's where we're attending to that student as an individual person. Developmentally,
yeah.
where are they? And what are they ready for? What are we, what are we going to give them next based on that learning profile? So many great things. I know we are winding down here and we want to leave some time for questions, but we cannot not address this. And I will start by saying here's another really great resource, by the way. Marianne Wolf, Reader Come Home. She addresses the technology question. So does Stanislaus Dehaene in
Hmm.
How We Learn. And the thing that I remember so vividly from his book, he claimed we are not going to ever replace an in-person teacher with technology. That's not a possibility. And he explains why. But one thing that I really took away from that, even babies, guess where learning starts? With eye contact. And a computer can't do that. So as teachers, I think, yes, we can use technology to make our instruction more efficient. We can use technology to give our students a lot of application opportunities, and we get valuable feedback. I think one of the best uses of technology is assessment. But again, nothing will replace sitting down and listening to a student read. At least we don't have the technology quite yet for that. But there are a lot of things we need to consider. Donell, the term digital wisdom resonated with you. Talk about
Yeah,
that.
because so this book, when it came out by Marianne Wolf, and it's another one I've dog-eared to death because it's really good. It's got some really interesting thoughts on emerging base of study about just how being in a digital world impacts the reading brain, right? So the reading brain that used to be touch and sense of hitting the page and actually running your finger along and having this very multidimensional, there's smells, there's sights, there's sounds, to a flat experience. And Marianne Wolf addresses that. I thought it was interesting. But one of the things that she talked about in the book was the lap moment where children climb into the lap, so they're in this sort of encased experience reading. And she said that just really hits it all. That hits all of the highlights of what you get from reading. is having that experience, and you're sharing the eye contact, hearing the voice modulate of that individual, the emotions that might cross the face, all of those experiences that come with reading, and what that means for individuals who are becoming readers, and how much that encourages them to become readers and get into the material. But I had that thought, Stacy, because I sat with one of my students just the other day, one of my adult learners again, who had missed a lot of these experiences because reading was always so very difficult. And we sat, we didn't have a lap moment. He's way too old for that, and that wouldn't be
It may
okay.
not be appropriate. Yeah.
May not be appropriate. But we sat next to each other and shared a book together. And I read a page, he read a page. I read a page, he read a
Yeah.
page, and he would see things cross over my face. And I was moving my finger along the page as I read, and I was getting excited at different points. And I noticed that he was really watching the page and watching me, watching the page, watching me. And when he stopped, he said, "Gosh, that was amazing."
Oh,
Oh,
that's
that's
so
what it is.
cool. And
Yeah,
there is no replacement for that. There is
no,
not, technology cannot replace that. Yes, it cannot respond in ways that teachers can, especially knowledgeable teachers, right? So going back to that, I guess we could sum up technology just by saying we do need to be wise about how we apply it in our classrooms and with our students and children. It's a new frontier, relatively
yeah.
speaking. So there's a lot we have to learn about it. So how will we know we're heading in the right direction? We're summing up here. I have listed Mississippi's NAEP scores intentionally, and these may sing to some of you and may not, but I am telling you, based on my own experience and teachers and schools I've worked with across the country, um, that when we do these things, our scores will trend upwards. But that's not the important thing, in my opinion. That's an indicator. But most importantly, our students will have the ability and the passion for reading and getting meaning out of that. So we've covered so much today. And as ever, Donell and I can talk forever about this stuff. We do it all the time. I will end with this slide. This is Donell and her son cross country skiing, and they have made it home every single time. So
To the
she's
car.
got the tools. Yeah, to the car where you need to go. So I really appreciate this time. I know we have a few questions. Jeanette, do you want to share
Yes,
some of them?
yes. Well, I'm so glad you wrapped it up with the happy ending to the story. So thank you for that. I think we could try to answer one question, and we will make good on this promise. All the questions that you put in the chat and in the question box, we will send to everybody via email. The answers that Stacy and Donell will write up for us, so you'll get your questions answered in a couple of weeks, maybe within 2 weeks. So one question that I think we could try to answer, we had a couple about independent reading and structured literacy. What is a good amount of independent reading for young children to do in a structured literacy kind of program?
Yeah, I think of that gradual release of responsibility model that we talk about so often, to, with, and by. And I think you really don't, I don't know that you can overdo the with and by. And so if we're talking about minutes, I feel like anytime you can include reading or writing in your instruction, it's going to be beneficial. Lots of studies have been done with sad results. In a typical classroom, a first grader reads a total of 20 minutes a week. That's not enough. That's not enough to congeal everything. So I appreciate the question, and we need to be attentive to it. I would say at a minimum, 20 minutes a day, at a minimum, then integrate it other places.
Oh, great. I think that's all we have time for, but again, we will send out the email following this. So we really appreciate everybody joining us today, and hope you enjoyed the information that you heard from Stacy and Donell. And just wanted to also thank you on behalf of Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Just a reminder, we've got some contact information for you here. If you want to contact us at readinghorizons.com, and we have Stacy's email address there too, and Donell's as well. So feel free to reach out to us. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope everybody has a good afternoon or evening or even morning if you happen to be in a completely different part of the world than we are. So have a great rest of the day.
Thank you all.